In 1776, it was the Revolution. In 1860, the Civil War. In 1941, the Global War. Do the math. We are here, now. The clock is striking 2025, and the cycle demands a climax, a total societal breakdown that remakes the map by 2032. But these cycles don't start by accident. They are triggered by the same recurring cancer, betrayal. History is not a series of random events. It is a linked, eternal cycle of elite machinations, personal vendettas, and calculated sacrifices. We're not looking at dates. We're diving into the classified memos and whispered archives to find the people who repeatedly stabbed their allies in the back, ensuring the crisis machine never stopped turning. This is the raw, unfiltered truth of the cycle, starting with the very foundations of the so-called land of the free. The first betrayal, spies, secret societies, and Arnold's ruin. The American Revolution was sold to us as a fight about taxes and liberty, but the powder keg was filled with French gold, not patriotic fervor. By 1775, the colonists had no supplies. They were desperate. Enter a shadowy French operation running through a shell company called Rodrigue Hortalez et Cie. This was the funnel. They didn't care about American freedom. They wanted to cripple their ancient enemy, Great Britain. Over 90% of the rebels' gunpowder, the very thing that allowed them to fight, was smuggled in through this secret, profit-driven pipeline. It was a proxy war waged by Europe's elite, using colonial dissatisfaction as the trigger. But that was just the financing. The movement itself was riddled with dark whispers of control. Look at the timeline. The Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, the exact same year the Bavarian Illuminati was officially founded. The Founding Fathers, men like Washington, were prominent master masons. Was this coincidence, or was the establishment of the United States an early, crucial step in a global plot to dismantle the monarchies of Europe and install a new order, as persistent rumors suggest? The very heart of the revolution was being guided by hands we couldn't see. And then there was the man who saw the corruption firsthand and flipped the entire table, Benedict Arnold. He wasn't just a bitter general. He was a brilliant commander who sacrificed his fortune and his body for the cause, only to be repeatedly snubbed for promotion by a jealous politic in Congress. He poured his own money into supplying the troops and ended up bankrupt. Historians confirm the personal slights, like General Gates stealing credit for the decisive victory at Saratoga, were the fuel. But the true architect of the treason, it's been said, wasn't Arnold himself. Enter Peggy Shippen, a Piranha, Philadelphia socialite with deep loyalist family ties. She married Arnold and became the key manipulator. She allegedly seduced him into the plot to surrender West Point, using her social standing to pass coded letters hidden in elaborate hairpieces and books to the British spy master John Andre. The plot was simple: surrender the most vital fortification on the Hudson for a massive payout. Arnold became the villain of history, but rumors suggest he was simply the desperate, wounded hero whose loyalty was financially and personally exhausted by a revolution that had already betrayed its own ideals of merit and honesty. The discovery of the plans in Andre's boot sealed Arnold's fate. He got $6,000 up front, but his name became a curse, proving that in this new world, loyalty was a commodity and ambition was a deadly currency. But the betrayal had just started. The stage was now set for the next, far bloodier act. The Emperor's Deceit, Napoleon, Talleyrand, and the Stolen Revolution. America's costly freedom left its biggest benefactor, France, absolutely destitute. Their national debt was catastrophic, the equivalent of 10 years of total revenue. When King Louis XVI called the nobles together to force new taxes, he betrayed his own class, unleashing the mob. Within a decade, the ideals of liberty had dissolved into the terror, where Robespierre, paranoid of counter-revolution, sent over 17,000 people to the guillotine. Yet even this descent was, it's been said, orchestrated. Jacobin clubs, the engines of the terror, were widely rumored to be fronts for the same radical Enlightenment-era secret societies we saw stirring the pot in America. They weren't seeking democracy, they were seeking a power vacuum. And who stepped into that power vacuum? A young Corsican artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte. In 1799, the upstart general executed the 18 Brumaire coup, dissolving the government with the point of a bayonet. He became first consul, then, in the ultimate slap in the face to the Republican ideal, crowned himself emperor in 1804. He betrayed the revolution's promise of equality and liberty, replacing it with sheer, relentless personal ambition. But Napoleon's betrayal was constantly mirrored by his own ministers. At the heart of his empire was the ultimate survivor, the slippery priest-turned-diplomat, Charles Maurice Talleyrand. Talleyrand was a master of self-preservation, serving the king, the revolution, the Directory, and Napoleon, only to secretly plot against them all. From 1808 onward, he was a double agent, secretly corresponding with Russia and Austria, leaking critical French military plans and profiting enormously from bribes. His philosophy was the blueprint for the elite cycle: self-preservation over loyalty. The crowning failure, the devastating 1812 invasion of Russia, saw Napoleon abandon 400,000 frozen troops in a retreat that decimated his army. And when he returned, his own marshals, led by Marmont, turned on him, surrendering Paris behind his back in 1814. Was this simply miscommunication, or was this the final calculated betrayal engineered by men like Talleyrand, ensuring they kept their wealth and status, regardless of who sat on the throne? Rumors suggest that the subsequent defeat at Waterloo was even cemented by Rothschild-financed intelligence that ensured Blücher's Prussians arrived just in time. Napoleon's fall taught Europe that the highest betrayal was always internal, setting up the continent for a century of simmering resentment and ultimately the next American crisis. But the wounds from the last turning hadn't closed yet. They were still festering in the South. Blood on the tracks. Lincoln, the Bankers' War, and the Great Betrayal. 80 years after Arnold's treason, the original compromise that founded the nation, slavery, ignited the Civil War. When Lincoln won in 1860, without a single Southern vote, secession was deemed the ultimate treason. The betrayal was immediate. Robert E. Lee, offered command of the Union forces, famously chose Virginia, weeping as he resigned. Yet beyond the moral battle of slavery, a far deeper, darker element was at play, one that conspiracy circles insist was the real catalyst for the war and its ultimate casualty. This was Lincoln's war against the international financiers. In 1862, facing crippling debt and European banks demanding exorbitant interest rates, Lincoln bypassed them entirely. He printed government-issued, interest-free currency, the greenbacks. This was a profound, systemic threat to the European banking elite who thrived on controlling national debt. It's been said that this move, more than the Emancipation Proclamation, sealed his fate. When John Wilkes Booth stepped into that box on April 14, 1865, he was no lone wolf assassin. 8 co-conspirators were tried and hanged, but the conspiracy theories persist, linking the plot not just to the Confederate Secret Service, but to those international bankers enraged by Lincoln's debt-free currency. Booth's diary was redacted and parts of it missing, hinting at a great crime plot far wider than just Southern vengeance. Lincoln's effort to free the nation from financial servitude ended with a bullet, a tragedy that many believe was secretly funded by the systems he sought to dismantle. But the final, most demoralizing betrayal came after the smoke cleared. By 1877, the North was tired of Reconstruction. The Great Betrayal saw the Republican Party trade the presidency to Rutherford Hayes in exchange for pulling the last federal troops out of the South. This immediately abandoned millions of newly freed Black Americans to the violence of Jim Crow, institutionalized terror, and economic servitude. The Union was rebuilt geographically, but the promise of freedom and equality was deliberately sacrificed for political expediency, ensuring the seeds of racial and economic inequality would sprout into the next cycle. And that next cycle would bring the entire world to the brink. The world betrayed, calculated sacrifices and secret pacts, 1914 to 1946. The next turning was the biggest one yet. World War I, 1914 to 1918, was the inevitable result of the Industrial Age and secret treaties. But the subsequent treaty, Versailles in 1919, was the true global betrayal. It wasn't a peace treaty, it was a punishment contract. Germany was forced to accept a war guilt clause and pay an impossible $33 billion in reparations. This sowed the stab-in-the-back myth that Jews and socialists had betrayed the undefeated German army, fueling the very resentment that propelled the Nazis to power 2 decades later. The treaty guaranteed the next war. And when that next war came, it began with deceit. Remember Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941? The official narrative is a surprise attack. But for decades, there have been persistent reports, supported by documents like the McCollum Memo, that President Roosevelt had advance knowledge via cracked Japanese JN-25 codes, but needed a spectacular event to drag a reluctant America into the fight. Rumors suggest intel was withheld and the fleet was kept in harm's way, making the sacrifice of thousands of lives a calculated move to secure global war entry and ultimately global dominance. The betrayals escalated until the very end. The Yalta Conference in 1945, often called the Secret Betrayal, saw Roosevelt and Churchill, supposedly allies of freedom, sign over Eastern Europe to Stalin's totalitarian grip. Declassified documents and personal accounts confirm this dooming of millions to Soviet gulags and decades of iron-fisted control. Later, the infamous Operation Keelhaul saw Western allies forcibly repatriate millions of Soviet citizens, many of whom fought against Stalin, sending them back to certain execution or the prison camps. This wasn't diplomacy. It was a cold, calculated trade-off of human lives for geopolitical advantage, birthing the Cold War and setting the stage for the modern economic cycle. Which leads us to the crisis we live in right now. The modern web, debt bubbles, lab leaks, and the final turning, 2008 to 2025. The modern fourth turning began not with guns, but with greed. The 2008 financial crisis was the ultimate betrayal of trust. Banks like Goldman Sachs were actively designing and selling toxic mortgage-backed assets to their clients, while simultaneously betting against those very assets. They packaged poison, sold it to retirees, and then profited when the whole thing collapsed. This wasn't an accident, it was fraud. And yet the ultimate outcome was a massive wealth transfer to the top, where those responsible were bailed out by taxpayers and almost no major executives went to jail. The cycle of elite impunity was complete. That unchecked corruption immediately ignited global instability. The Arab Spring 2011 was framed as a democratic wave,
but reports claim it was backed by external Western funds that ultimately destabilized the region, creating the chaos that bred ISIS. The most recent explosion came in Europe. The 2014 Euromaidan protests in Ukraine that sparked the Russian conflict was, according to persistent theories, managed from the outside. The infamous leaked phone call from U.S. State Department official Victoria Nuland, where she crudely said, "Damn the EU," admitting to U.S. involvement and billions spent on democracy promotion, strongly suggests foreign orchestration. It cemented the narrative of a managed coup, leading directly to Russia's annexation of Crimea and the subsequent 2022 invasion, a war built on years of broken diplomatic promises. Then came the greatest global crisis of our time, COVID-19. For years, the narrative of a lab leak was dismissed as a conspiracy theory. Now, in 2025, intelligence reports, including those from the CIA, lean toward a lab origin from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. This betrayal runs deep. U.S. funding, via the EcoHealth Alliance, supported gain-of-function research on bat viruses, research that could have made a virus more transmissible or deadly. If proven, this would mean the institutions designed to protect the public health were actively funding the creation of the disaster. And finally, the most recent chilling intelligence failure, the October 7th Hamas attack. Rumors persist of an IDF intelligence betrayal or stand-down orders. How was the most technologically watched border in the world breached? Yair Netanyahu, the Prime Minister's son, publicly accused the military establishment of a cover-up. This deep, systemic failure, be it deliberate or simply negligent, is the latest example of internal collapse fueling external war, echoing the intelligence failures that led to Pearl Harbor and the moral failures that defined the Great Betrayal of 1877. The red thread, the climax, is here. We stand now in 2025, precisely at the apex of the fourth turning. The patterns are identical. Complacency has bred corruption. The system is riddled with untouchable elites, the bankers, the intelligence agencies, the diplomats, who prioritize self-preservation and profit over the public good. Strauss and Howe predicted this climax would involve economic collapse, domestic breakdown, or a great power conflict that reshapes the world by 2030-2035. Look around. We are witnessing global currency instability, escalating cyber warfare, and the largest near-peer conflict since 1945. Every crisis we investigated, Arnold's treason, Talleyrand's deceit, Lincoln's assassination, Yalta's forced repatriations, the 2008 financial rigging, was a system-shocking betrayal that tore at the social fabric. And every betrayal pushed the cycle one step closer to where we are today. The question is no longer if the world will change. The question is, what shocking betrayal will trigger the final irreversible descent into the crisis that defines this generation? History doesn't just repeat, it rhymes. And the next verse of betrayal is being written right now.